Sharp knocking at the door. Claire, 8 months pregnant, opens an envelope with trembling hands. Claire, voice breaking, eyes red. Grant, this is divorce papers. While I am carrying your child. Conference room. 6 lawyers lined up across the table. Grant sits silent, eyes cast down. Russell Crane, cold, we'd like Mrs. Whitfield to review the proposed settlement framework. The door opens. Dorothy steps in unhurried, wearing a simple cream blouse. Crane stops mid-sentence. Grant goes pale. Dorothy, voice low, not a single flicker of emotion. I know the Meridian Group. 9 years. 17% of preferred shares. Crane looks at Grant. Grant stares at his own hands. Dorothy, turning to Grant, eyes sharp as glass. You thought my daughter was alone. You miscalculated. Grant opens his mouth. Nothing comes out. A man who thought he had planned everything until he met the woman standing behind his wife. Tell us free watch now to find out who Dorothy Haynes really is and exactly what happened to those 6 lawyers. The morning started the way most Tuesdays did. Coffee, the radio, the low hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle. Claire Whitfield stood at the kitchen window in her bathrobe, one hand wrapped around her mug, one hand resting on her stomach. 8 months pregnant. The baby was quiet that morning. She remembers noticing that. She remembers thinking, good, rest while you can. The light was still thin at that hour, that pale October light that comes sideways through kitchen windows and makes everything look both ordinary and a little fragile. She watched a sparrow land on the garden fence, hop twice, then fly away. She thought about her day. She had a call with a client at 10. A landscape project, residential, a family in the hills who wanted a garden their children could grow up in. She had been looking forward to that call. She thought about the nursery. She still needed to put the second set of shelves up. The brackets were in a box in the hallway. She had been meaning to get to that all week. She thought about how her back felt. Not too bad. Better than yesterday. Small Tuesday thoughts. Ordinary ones. The kind of thoughts you have when your life feels settled. When you have no reason to think about anything more complicated than sparrows and shelf brackets. The knock at the door came at 7:43. Not a doorbell, a knock. 3 sharp raps, the kind that means something official. She set down her mug, shuffled to the front door, pulled it open. A man in a gray suit stood on the porch. Young, mid-20s, he looked uncomfortable. The way people look when they have been sent to do something they would rather not do. He said her name, Claire Whitfield. She said yes. He handed her the envelope. It was thick, cream-colored, the kind of envelope that costs more than it should, heavy in her hand. The weight of it registered before anything else did. And across the front, in clean block letters, she read the name of a law firm she did not recognize. 6 names, 6 partners, 6 lawyers. The man in the gray suit nodded once. Then he walked back to his car. A white sedan parked at the curb. He drove away without looking back. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway. The envelope was still in her hand. She held it for a long time without opening it. This is not what I think it is. That was her first thought. Pure, clean denial. Grant would have said something. We had dinner together last night. He poured me sparkling water with lemon the way I like it. He asked how my back was feeling. She walked back to the kitchen, set the envelope on the counter, picked up her coffee. It had gone cold without her noticing. She stood there, looking at the envelope, then she opened it. The first word she saw was petition. The second word was dissolution. The third word was custody. Her knees went soft. She grabbed the counter's edge. The marble was cold under her palm. She remembers that. How cold the marble was. How real and solid and cold. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. Her eyes kept sliding off the words, legal language moving past her like water she could not quite hold. But certain phrases stuck. Irreconcilable differences, separate financial assets, prenuptial agreement provisions, physical and legal custody of the minor child. The minor child who was not yet born, who was right here, under her hand. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. The baby did not move, just still, just quiet. The phone on the counter lit up. A text from Grant, good morning. I have back-to-back meetings. Do not wait up. That was it. That was the whole text. She picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again, stared at his name in her contacts. Grant Whitfield, husband. She had labeled him that. Back when it felt like something to be proud of. She looked at those 2 words for a long moment. Then she scrolled past his name, past her mother, past her dentist, past 3 colleagues. She stopped at Nora. She pressed call. Nora picked up on the second ring. She always did. What happened? Nora said. Not hello. Not good morning. Just what happened? Because Nora could tell from the quality of Claire's breathing that something had shifted on a molecular level. He sent lawyers, Claire said. A pause. How many? Nora asked. 6, Nora. 6 lawyers. I am 8 months pregnant. He sent 6 lawyers to our front door. She heard Nora set something down, something heavy. A coffee cup on a tile floor. I am on my way, Nora said. You do not have to. I am already putting on my shoes. The line stayed open. Claire could hear the sounds of Nora moving. A door, keys, the small particular sounds of a friend in motion. I will be there in 20 minutes, Nora said. Okay, Claire said. She hung up, set the phone down, looked at the document spread across the counter like a map of a country she had never agreed to visit. She moved to the kitchen table, sat down. The clock on the microwave read 7:51, 8 minutes. Her whole marriage, or what she had thought was her marriage, had unraveled in 8 minutes. She looked at the baby names list still stuck to the refrigerator door. They had written it together 2 months ago, sitting right here at this same table. Grant had suggested the name Emmett for a boy. She had circled it with a green marker. She had been happy when she did that. She remembered being happy. The green marker was still on the table. She picked it up, turned it in her fingers, put it down again. He poured me sparkling water with lemon. He asked how my back was feeling. She did not understand. She did not understand how a person could pour someone sparkling water with lemon and send them divorce papers the same week. She did not understand how those two things could live in the same human being at the same time. The baby moved, one solid kick, like a reminder. I am still here. I know, she whispered. I know, baby. I know. She did not know what she knew, but she said it anyway, because it was all she had right then, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the only thing you can do is acknowledge what is there, even when you cannot name it yet. She sat at the table and she waited for Nora. The October light moved through the window. The microwave clock changed numbers. The dishwasher finished its cycle and went quiet. Outside, the sparrow came back to the garden fence. She watched it. Ordinary Tuesday morning, and not ordinary at all. Both things at once. Nora arrived in 19 minutes flat. She lived across town. She drove fast when she was angry. She came through the front door without knocking. She had a key, had always had a key. She stopped when she saw Claire sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of her, still in her bathrobe, hands folded on top of her belly. Nora looked at her for a moment, just looked. The way people look when they are taking inventory of someone they love. Then she picked up the first page of the petition. She read it standing up, coat still on, keys still in her hand. She read for a long time. Okay, Nora said finally. Okay, Claire asked. I am processing. Nora set the page down, picked up another. Read that one too. Claire, this is thorough. This is not something you draft in a week. The prenuptial provisions alone— I signed that prenup, Claire said. He said it was standard. Did you have an attorney review it? Claire was quiet. Grant said it was just a formality, she said. Nora closed her eyes, briefly, just for a moment. He said our families both had assets to protect. He said everyone does it. He said his lawyers would handle it. Claire looked at the document. His lawyers. I did not even think about that. His lawyers drafted my prenup. Nora sat down across from her. She did not say I told you so. She never did. That was one of the things Claire loved about her. There were people in the world who stored up those moments like currency. Nora was not one of them. Instead, Nora said, how long do you think this has been in motion? The question hit Claire somewhere she had not been ready. How long? She thought about the past month, Grant's late nights, his new habit of locking his phone screen when she walked past. The way he had started copying his assistant on every single email. Everyone. So there was always a paper trail showing he had been here, not there. She thought about Christmas. His family had come for the holidays. His mother, Patricia, polished and formal, always faintly disapproving, had looked at Claire across the dinner table with an expression Claire had read as pity. At the time, she had assumed it was about the pregnancy weight. Now she was not sure. How long? She thought about the conversation 3 months ago when Grant had insisted on rearranging their finances, moving her name off the joint investment account. Just for tax purposes, he had said. My accountant recommended it. She had signed the form without reading it. She had been 6 months pregnant and tired, and she trusted him. She trusted him. The baby shifted again, a slow roll this time, like a boat on calm water. Nora, Claire said, what if this has been planned for a while? Then, Nora said carefully, you were maneuvered into a very vulnerable position. Deliberately. The word fell into the room and stayed there. Claire's throat went tight, not with crying, with something harder. Something that lives behind crying. It was not a marriage falling apart. It was a marriage being dismantled. Around me. While I was building a nursery. She thought about the baby's room down the hall. The yellow walls she had painted herself in the second trimester. The white crib Grant had assembled with exaggerated patience. He had taken a photo of himself doing it and sent it to his parents, performing fatherhood before he walked away from it. No, she stopped that thought. She did not know that yet. She needed to be fair. But the thoughts kept coming. The reason he had suggested naming the baby early, so we can start thinking of them as a person. That had seemed tender at the time. Now she wondered if it was something else. Establishing personhood for legal purposes. Establishing that he was involved in the naming. She pressed her palms flat on the table. I need a lawyer, she said. Yes, said Nora. A good one. Yes, not his kind of lawyer, not someone who will let this happen to me. Nora was already reaching for her phone. But then Claire said something else, something that came out of nowhere, or maybe from somewhere very deep. I need to call my mother. Nora looked up from her phone. Your mother, she said slowly. Yes, Nora and Claire had been friends since their late 20s. Nora knew most things about Claire. She knew about the complicated relationship with the father who had left when Claire was 12. She knew about the years of quiet financial struggle. She knew about the scholarship Claire had earned for college and the pride she had taken in doing it herself. What Nora did not entirely know was the full picture of Dorothy Haynes, Claire's mother. Most people, if they met Dorothy Haynes, would see a quiet 62-year-old woman. Silver-haired, soft-spoken, fond of gardening and classical music and long walks. She lived in a modest house in rural Connecticut. She drove a 10-year-old Volvo. She was also the majority stakeholder in a diversified holding company with assets in manufacturing, commercial real estate, and agricultural supply chains across 11 states. Dorothy had spent 30 years building that empire quietly, methodically, without fanfare, without press coverage, without announcements of any kind. She had raised Claire to be the same way, to move through the world without announcing what she carried. Do not lead with what you have, Dorothy had always said. Lead with who you are. Claire had done exactly that. She had built her own career in landscape architecture. She had paid her own rent before Grant. She had not told Grant about her mother's wealth until after they were engaged. And even then she had described it as comfortable, which was technically true. She had not described it as transformative. She had not described it as call-off 6 lawyers transformative. Because Dorothy had always said, the right people will not need to know, and the wrong people will use it against you. Claire looked at the document spread across her table. She looked at the 6 names on the law firm letterhead. She reached for her phone. The wrong people, she thought, just declared war. She found her mother's number, pressed call. Dorothy picked up on the second ring. Claire. Her mother's voice was the same as always, low and steady, like water over smooth stone. I have been waiting for you to call. Claire stopped. Waiting, she said. Your husband, Dorothy said carefully, retained Russell Crane's firm 3 weeks ago. I was informed through channels you do not need to worry about. The kitchen went very still. Mom, Claire said, why did you not tell me? Because I needed you to see it for yourself first. I needed you to open that envelope with your own hands. Because what comes next, you need to want it. Not just accept it because I arranged it. What comes next? Claire asked. Pause. Brief. The kind that contains a lot. I am driving up tomorrow, Dorothy said. Do not speak to his lawyers. Do not speak to Grant either if you can avoid it. And sweetheart, yes? You are not alone in this. You never were. Claire held the phone. She looked at Nora, who had been listening to one side of this conversation with the expression of someone watching a puzzle assemble itself. Your mother knew, Nora said. My mother knew, Claire confirmed. Nora sat back in her chair. She looked at the documents. She looked at Claire. Claire, she said. I know, Claire said. Who exactly is your mother? Claire looked at the 6 names on the letterhead. Someone, she said slowly, who has been very quiet for a very long time. Grant came home at 10:47 that night. Claire heard the garage door, then his footsteps in the mudroom. That particular rhythm she knew without thinking about it. The left foot slightly heavier. The pause where he always checked his phone before coming all the way in. She tracked those sounds the way women track sounds in the dark, without deciding to, without realizing she was doing it. She was sitting in the living room, lights on, documents on the coffee table. He came around the corner and stopped. He looked at the documents, then at her, then at the documents again. Something moved across his face, just for a moment, something that might have been regret, or might have been recalculation. Then it settled back into the expression she had seen more and more lately, measured, patient, like a man waiting out a thunderstorm from behind glass. Claire, he said. Grant, she said. He sat down in the armchair across from her, not beside her, not close. The armchair that had always been his, the one he had chosen when they furnished the house. She noticed that now. The way he had always claimed the chair that let him see the whole room. I should have told you in person, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. I know this is hard, do you? She asked. Quiet, not sharp, just a real question. Do you actually know how hard this is? Because I am sitting here wondering how long you have been planning this. I keep thinking about our baby Grant, who is not born yet, who I am carrying right now. While you sent a process server to our door, he folded his hands. The timing is not ideal. The timing, she said. She let that sit there. I know, he said. I know how it looks. Do you know how it feels? She asked. He did not answer that. This was one of the things she had slowly learned about Grant. He was extraordinarily good at appearing emotionally present, at leaning forward, making eye contact, nodding in the right places. He had fooled her for years with this technique. She had mistaken performance for genuine feeling. She did not make that mistake tonight. I had our prenup reviewed today, she said. By someone I called myself. Someone I found myself. Something flickered in his expression. You moved me off the joint investment account in October, she said. Your name only, now. Our joint savings account still has both names, but there is almost nothing in it. The investment account has just over $400,000. He said nothing. The prenup says that assets accumulated before marriage remain separate, but it also says, and this is interesting, Grant, this is a very interesting clause, that any assets transferred during the marriage from a joint account to a sole account within 24 months of filing for divorce can be classified as marital property subject to division. He was very still now. I found a family law attorney this afternoon. She reviewed it in 3 hours. She said your lawyers made an error. Claire tilted her head slightly. Or maybe it was not an error. Maybe whoever drafted my prenup was so confident I would never read it, that I would never have anyone explain it to me, that they got careless. Grant uncrossed his legs, recrossed them. Claire, he said, let us not make this adversarial. You sent 6 lawyers to my door while I am 8 months pregnant, she said. I think adversarial is the appropriate register. He tried a different approach then. She could see him shifting gears, the pivot from reason to warmth. I still care about you, he said. I always will. We just grew apart. You have to feel that too. We have not been happy. I was happy, she said quietly, not defensively, just truthfully. I know I am supposed to say I could see it coming, that we had been struggling for years. But I was happy, Grant. I was building a life I believed in. Maybe that is the difference between us. He looked away. Was it Bethany? She asked. The name landed like a stone in still water. He did not deny it. That strangely was almost a relief. She had been carrying that suspicion for 2 months, the late nights, the shift in his phone habits, the way he had mentioned Bethany in conversation 3 times and then stopped mentioning her at all. Absence is evidence. It started last spring, he said. Last spring. When Claire was 3 months pregnant. She nodded. Filed that information somewhere internal. She did not cry. She would cry later. She knew that. The tears were there waiting behind a door that had not opened yet. Right now there was just this cold, clear, almost detached focus. 3 months pregnant. She had been exhausted and nauseated and completely in love with the possibility of their family. She had been tracking the baby's size in fruit comparisons, the size of a lime, the size of a peach, sending Grant little updates, the size of a peach, and his father was already gone. She took a slow breath. I want you to leave tonight, she said. I would like to sleep in my house without you in it. This is my house, she said. I bought it. My name is on the deed. Whatever your lawyers want to argue about later, that is a fact that will not change before morning. He looked at her. For just a moment, she saw something pass through his eyes that she had not seen in a long time, something that looked almost like genuine feeling. Like he was seeing her, actually seeing her for the first time in a while. Then it passed. He stood, straightened his jacket. I will stay at the Beaumont, he said. Thank you, she said. He picked up his keys from the hall table, paused at the living room doorway. For what it is worth, he said, I think you will be okay, Claire. You are stronger than you know. She said nothing. The garage door opened, the car backed out, the garage door closed, and she sat in the silence of her house, and she thought about a peach, about how small and perfect they are, how you can hold one in your palm. She pressed her hand to her stomach. He is wrong, by the way, she said to the baby. Not about me being okay, about the reason. It is not my strength, she paused. It is yours. She stayed in the living room for a while after that, not doing anything, just sitting with the quiet. The documents were still spread across the coffee table. 6 lawyers' names at the top of the first page. She thought about what it meant to be this prepared. All those weeks ago, while she was picking out yellow paint for the nursery. While she was assembling the name list and circling Emmett with a green marker. While she was measuring the wall for the shelf brackets. He had been meeting with lawyers. She thought about the Christmas dinner, his mother's expression across the table. That look she had read as pity about the pregnancy weight. She knew, Claire thought. His mother knew. The thing about being underestimated is that it has a very particular feeling. She recognized it now, looking back. The way people around her had been careful with her, solicitous in a way that now seemed less like care and more like management. Managing the pregnant wife, making sure she does not notice, making sure she feels taken care of right up until the moment she is not. She sat with that thought until it settled. Then she stood, turned off the living room lights, climbed the stairs. She did not go to the nursery. Not yet. She was not ready for that. She went to bed. Lay on her side, the pillow between her knees the way Dr. Caldwell had suggested. The baby moved once, a small, slow movement. She put her hand on her stomach. We are going to be all right, she said. She believed it. Almost completely. That would have to be enough for tonight. Dorothy Haynes arrived the next morning in her 10-year-old Volvo. She pulled into the driveway at 8:15. She was wearing tan slacks, a cream blouse, and sensible walking shoes. She carried one overnight bag and a brown paper bag from a bakery 2 towns over, the good one, the one that had been in business since 1971. She let herself in with the spare key she had had for years. Claire heard her in the kitchen, heard the particular sound of her mother moving through a space. Efficient, quiet, purposeful, the click of the kettle, the soft thud of the bakery bag on the counter. She came down the stairs slowly. 8 months along made the stairs a negotiation. She held the railing, took each step with care. She found her mother standing at the kitchen window. Dorothy turned. She looked at her daughter for a long moment, the way mothers look when they have driven 2 hours to be somewhere, when they have been holding something since the moment they got in the car. Then she crossed the kitchen and held her. She did not say anything. Dorothy Haynes had never been a woman of unnecessary words. She just held her, one hand on Claire's back, one hand on the back of her head. And Claire pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and breathed. She smelled like the lavender soap she had used Claire's entire life. Some things do not change. Some things are designed not to. After a while, Dorothy stepped back, held Claire at arm's length, looked at her the way that mothers look, that particular assessment that takes in everything at once. The color under the eyes, the set of the shoulders, the quality of the grief. "Sit down," Dorothy said. "I will make tea." They sat at the kitchen table. The documents were still there. Dorothy glanced at them briefly but did not touch them yet. She poured 2 cups of tea. She cut the Danish from the bakery into careful halves. "Tell me what you know," she said. Claire told her. All of it. The envelope, the prenup, the conversation with Grant, Bethany, the October account transfer. She spoke carefully and completely. Dorothy listened without interrupting. This had always been her gift, the ability to receive information without leaking reaction. When Claire finished, Dorothy picked up her teacup. "Warren Stills is driving up from New Haven today," she said. Warren Stills, her mother's attorney. Claire had met him once at a family gathering years ago. She remembered a quiet man who wore unremarkable suits and said very little at the dinner table. She had later learned he was considered one of the most formidable private legal counsels in the Northeast. "Mom," Claire said, "how serious is this?" Dorothy set down her cup, looked at her daughter directly. "Grant's firm, Russell Crane's firm, is experienced in high-asset divorces. They are very good at one particular thing, moving fast, creating a document landscape that overwhelms the other party. 6 lawyers at once creates a psychological effect before it creates a legal one. The goal is to make you feel outgunned before you have had a chance to understand that you are not." "He thought I would not have resources," Claire said slowly. "He thought you were alone," Dorothy said. "That is a different thing." Claire absorbed that. "Did he know about what you have?" Dorothy considered her answer with care. "He knew what you told him, that I was comfortable, that I had some investments." A pause. "He had me investigated as a matter of due diligence when you were engaged. Standard practice in his circles. What the investigation turned up was consistent with what you had described. A retired businesswoman with modest assets, living quietly in Connecticut, because that is what you wanted them to find." Dorothy's expression was even, steady, but something in her eyes moved. Something that in another woman might have been called satisfaction. "I have spent 30 years arranging my affairs to appear exactly as complicated as I choose them to appear," she said. "No more, no less." Claire thought about Grant, about Russell Crane, about the 6 names on that letterhead and the confidence behind them. They sent 6 lawyers to intimidate a pregnant woman they thought had no one. She thought about what her mother had just said. "He thought you were alone." "That is a different thing." The doorbell rang. Dorothy rose. "That will be Warren." Warren Stills turned out to be exactly as Claire remembered. Quiet, unremarkable looking, in a suit that cost more than its appearance suggested. He shook Claire's hand. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened a worn leather briefcase. He read the petition with the focused silence of a man who reads legal documents the way others read novels. Not for the words, but for what the words are reaching for. He read it twice. Then he set it down and said, "The filing was premature." "What do you mean?" Claire asked. "They are trying to establish legal posture before the child is born. Once the birth occurs, custody provisions become considerably more contested. They wanted to have a framework in place first, one that positions Grant favorably in terms of primary residence and financial obligation." He glanced at Dorothy. "The prenup clause regarding the October transfer is what I expected." Dorothy nodded. Claire looked between them. "You expected this," she said. "Yes," Warren said. "Both of you." "Yes," Dorothy said. Claire sat with that. Warren Stills opened his briefcase again, removed a folder, set it on the table between them. "3 weeks ago," he said, "when your mother informed me of the Crane firm's engagement, we began preparing a response." Claire opened the folder. She looked at the first document. Then she looked at her mother. "Mom," she said, "this is a countersuit." "Yes," said Dorothy. "For financial coercion during pregnancy." "Yes." "Under these are 3 separate legal statutes." Dorothy lifted her teacup. "Drink your tea, sweetheart. It is getting cold." Claire looked at the folder, then at her mother, then at Warren Stills. "How long has this been ready?" she asked. 11 days, Warren said. 11 days, while she had been measuring walls and tracking the baby's movements and thinking about shelf brackets. She thought about what her mother had said on the phone that first morning. "What comes next, you need to want it. Not just accept it because I arranged it." She understood that now. Dorothy could have sent Warren before the envelope arrived, could have intercepted the whole thing, could have protected her daughter in a way that kept Claire at the center of a situation she never truly understood. She had not done that. She had waited. Because she needed Claire to open the envelope herself, to read the words herself, to decide herself that she wanted to fight. Nora arrived at noon with Thai food and righteous fury in roughly equal measure. She laid containers across the kitchen table. Pad see-ew, spring rolls, the mango sticky rice she knew Claire was craving. She sat down and looked at Dorothy with the expression of someone finally meeting the person they had heard about for years. Dorothy looked back at her with that same steady assessment. "You are the one who drove over in 19 minutes, Dorothy said. "She needed me," Nora said simply. Dorothy nodded once, accepting that, filing it. "She still will," Dorothy said. "Legal machinery needs a counterpart, someone who is not part of it." Nora looked at Claire. "Then I am staying," she said. Nobody argued. 4 of them at the kitchen table, the documents in the center, the mango sticky rice in the corner, the October light coming through the window. Something passed between them, quiet and solid, the kind of understanding that needs no words and asks for nothing except presence. And presence for now was everything. Grant called at noon the following day. His number lit up Claire's screen 3 times before she answered. Warren Stills had advised her that she could communicate through counsel, but that for now, being responsive was strategically useful. "Let him underestimate the pace at which you are moving," Warren had said. "Men like Grant expect paralysis at this stage, shock and stasis. Do not correct that impression yet," so she answered Claire. Grant's voice was carefully modulated, the voice he used in board meetings. Not cold, controlled. "I wanted to check in." "I am fine," she said. "The baby is fine." "Good, that is good." A pause. "My lawyers are going to be reaching out today. Or to a representative, if you have retained someone." "I have retained someone," she said. A brief silence. She could almost hear him recalibrating. "Good," he said. "I want this to be civil, Claire. I really do. I know the timing has been terrible," she said. "Yes, I know, and I am sorry about that." He sounded, she noted, genuinely sorry about the timing, not about the thing itself. The timing. She thanked him for calling. She said she would have her attorney follow up with Russell Crane's office. She kept her voice even. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand. She thought about all the phone calls she had been on with him over the years, the ones where she had shaped her responses around what he needed to hear. The careful calibration of her own reactions, the exhausting mental mathematics of managing his comfort while ignoring her own. "I have been managing this man for 7 years, she thought. "I am done managing him." She set the phone face down on the table. Then she caught herself. That habit, face down. How long had she been doing that? She picked it back up, set it face up, small things. She stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she got up and went back to the kitchen table where Warren's folders were spread. She was not done. Warren came back downstairs just after 1. He was carrying a second folder. "This arrived by courier," he said. He placed it on the table in front of Claire. "Russell Crane's office. The financial disclosure package." Claire looked at the envelope. "This is what they want to show me," she thought. "This is their version of our marriage." She opened it. The first page was a financial summary, Grant's declared assets, his income, his business interests. She turned to the second page, and she stopped. She read the line again and again. "Warren," she said slowly. "Yes," he said. "This says Grant's business currently holds a liability, a pending contractual dispute, of approximately $3 million. $3,200,000, Warren confirmed. "I did not know about that." "No," Warren said. "You would not have." He filed the corporate disclosure separate from the marital disclosure. "The document you are holding is designed to present his financial picture as less favorable than it actually is, in order to reduce alimony exposure. But it also inadvertently reveals the liability. Which means, Warren said, that he is under considerably more financial pressure than he was willing to show you. This divorce, the timing of it, may be less about emotional distance and more about financial strategy." The room went quiet. Dorothy set down her tea. Nora, sitting in the corner with a legal pad she had been using to take notes, stopped writing. Claire set the document down. She thought about October, about her name coming off the investment account, about the careful maneuvering of the past 6 months. The late nights that were not entirely about Bethany, the meetings that went long, the tension he had passed off as work stress. He was drowning, she thought, and he was trying to cut weight. And the heaviest thing in his boat, apparently, was her. Something shifted inside her then, not more hurt. She was past the stage where new information added to the wound. This was something different, something that lives on the other side of hurt. Clarity. She was not a heartbroken wife discovering a betrayal. She was a woman who had been asset managed by someone she had loved. And now she could see the whole board. He needed the prenup to hold, she said. Yes, said Warren. He needed me not to have counsel. Yes. He needed me to be shocked and slow and isolated. All of those things, Warren said. Claire folded her hands, looked at her mother across the table. Dorothy met her eyes and said nothing. She had already said everything she needed to say. You are not alone in this. You never were. Okay, Claire said. She reached across the table, picked up Warren's folder, walked me through our response. They worked for 3 hours. Warren explained each provision. Helena Cross, the family attorney Dorothy had brought in, laid out the timeline of the countersuit. David Marshall, the forensic accountant, walked Claire through the financial analysis. Every transfer, every account movement, every number that did not add up to what Grant had told her. She listened. She asked questions. She took notes in a small notebook she had found in the kitchen drawer. Her handwriting was steady. She noticed that. How steady her handwriting was. Her hands were not shaking. She was not crying. She was not frozen. She was here, fully here, taking notes with a steady hand while the people her mother had assembled did what they had spent their careers learning to do. There was something almost extraordinary about it. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just clear. She had been afraid since that first morning that she would not be able to hold herself together, that the weight of it would be too much. 8 months pregnant, a marriage dismantled, 6 lawyers at her door. She had been afraid she would collapse. She had not collapsed. She turned the page in her notebook. Tell me about the custody provisions, she said to Helena. What are our strongest arguments? Helena Cross looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was close to one. Let us start from the beginning, Helena said. That night, after Dorothy had gone to the guest room and Warren had returned to New Haven, and Nora had finally, reluctantly, driven home, Claire was alone. She turned off the kitchen lights, checked the front door lock, the side door, the garage, small rituals, the kind you do without thinking, the kind that say, I am here, I am closing the day, I am keeping this space. She climbed the stairs slowly. She passed her bedroom door, kept walking. She ended up in the nursery. She did not turn the light on. The streetlight outside came through the thin curtains, soft amber, the color of almost dark, enough to see the white crib, the rocking chair in the corner, the shelf she had put up herself where a row of small animals waited, a rabbit, a bear, a small wooden elephant with its trunk raised, which is supposed to bring luck. She lowered herself into the rocking chair. It took a moment. 8 months is a project. She sat in the almost dark. The house was quiet around her. That particular quiet of a house when everyone in it has gone to sleep. It is different from empty house quiet. It is the quiet of other people's breathing, unseen, filling the space from a distance. Her mother was down the hall. That should have been comforting. It was, mostly. But there was something about being alone in this room in the dark that was its own thing, something she needed. The rocking chair creaked as she shifted her weight. And then the door that had been holding back the tears, the one she had known was there since the first morning, finally opened. She did not cry loudly. She never had. She cried the way people cry when they have had a lot of practice keeping it quiet. Shoulders shaking, hands over her face, the sound barely more than a breath. She cried for the marriage she had believed in. She cried for the version of Grant she had loved. The one who had sat at the kitchen table and suggested the name Emmett with such apparent sincerity, who had assembled the crib with exaggerated patience, who had poured sparkling water with lemon because he knew she liked it. She cried for that person. Even knowing what she knew now, because that person had been real to her. And losing something real is always a loss, regardless of what the real thing turned out to be underneath. She cried for the plans, the shared calendar with the pediatrician appointment already blocked off, the way she had imagined with such clear detail, the 3 of them, her and Grant and the baby, going somewhere simple, like the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. A small, ordinary life that turned out to be a building with no foundation. She cried for the version of herself that had not known, that had been so certain, that had painted yellow walls and circled names in green marker, and believed, completely and genuinely believed, that she was building something that would hold. She cried until she ran out, and then she sat in the rocking chair in the quiet. The baby moved. A slow, deliberate roll, like a fish turning in still water. Hello, she thought. Still here. She put both hands on her stomach. I am scared, she said. She said it out loud because she needed to hear herself say it, because she had spent the entire day being clear-eyed and strategic and calm. And that was necessary, and she was proud of herself for it. But it had cost something, and here in the dark she was going to name what it cost. I am scared I will not be enough, she said. I am scared of doing this alone. I am scared that whatever I build will have this at its foundation, this broken thing. I am scared that someday you will ask me why it happened. And I will have to tell you, she paused. The rocking chair creaked softly. And I am scared, she said, that I gave someone access to the most important thing in my life, and he treated it like a transaction. She sat with that. Outside, a car passed on the street. Its headlights swept across the ceiling briefly, then gone. She thought about her father, who had also left, who had done it differently. Not with lawyers, but with a single conversation, a Tuesday morning, and then absence. She had been 12. She had spent years, quiet years, wondering what she had done wrong. She knew now that she had not done anything wrong. But knowing and feeling are two different countries, and she still sometimes found herself at the border between them. I know I am not the reason he left, she thought. I know that, and yet, she sat with the and yet for a while. It did not go away. She did not expect it to. Some things do not go away. They just become something you can carry without dropping everything else. She thought about her mother, Dorothy, who had rebuilt quietly after Claire's father left, who had not made her bitterness visible to her daughter, who had never said all men are this way or never trust anyone, or any of the easy lessons that cost the person learning them more than the person teaching them. Dorothy had said, lead with who you are, and she had shown it. By building something real, by being something real, by raising a daughter who, even now, at the bottom of her darkest evening, was not asking why me, was asking what next. What next? She sat with that question. The nursery was very quiet. The amber light from the street lamp made soft shadows across the crib. The wooden elephant sat on the shelf with its trunk raised. She thought about all the days between now and the day this child would be old enough to understand what had happened. All those days of ordinary mornings and ordinary choices. Coffee and the radio and the garden. Work with her name on it. A life built slowly and on solid ground. Those days were still ahead. All of them. Every single one. Her phone was on the floor beside the rocking chair. She picked it up. The screen read 2:14 in the morning. She opened her notes app. She started to write. Not a legal document. Not a plan. Just thoughts. The way you write at 2 in the morning when you need to get what is inside you outside you so you can look at it. Things I know to be true, she wrote. She paused. Then she wrote, my baby deserves a mother who is whole. She stopped, looked at that sentence. I am not yet whole, but I am more whole than I was this morning, and tomorrow I will be more whole than tonight. She kept writing. He was not the architecture of my life. He was a room in it. A room I am walking out of. I am not starting over. I am starting forward. She looked at what she had written. I am not starting over. I am starting forward. That was the difference. She had been afraid of the phrase starting over since the morning of the envelope. Because starting over implies you lose everything, that you go back to zero, that the years and the work and the love and the building of a life, all of it disappears. But that was not what was happening. She was not going back. She was going forward, with everything she had learned, with everything she had built that was hers, with the career, the garden, the house with her name on the deed, the child, with her mother in the guest room, with Warren Stills's folder on the kitchen table, with Nora who drove 19 minutes in the dark because she needed her. Forward, she thought, not over. Forward. She closed the notes app, set the phone down. She reached over and touched the small wooden elephant on the shelf, the one with its trunk raised. She said quietly, you can bring luck now. We are ready. She sat in the rocking chair for a while longer. Not sleeping, not crying, not planning, just being there. In the yellow room she had painted herself. In the chair she had carried up the stairs with Nora's help on a Saturday afternoon in June. In the house with her name on the deed. Being there, that was enough. At some point she fell asleep in the rocking chair. She woke at 5:45 to light coming through the curtains. Her neck was stiff. The baby was already awake, moving in that particular purposeful morning way. And downstairs she could hear the kettle clicking on. Her mother, already up, already making tea. Claire pressed her hands to her face, took a breath, then she got up. The mediation was scheduled for the following Thursday. Russell Crane's office had proposed it as an informal preliminary discussion. The language designed to suggest it was low stakes. An opening conversation, a chance to begin dialogue before things escalated. Warren Stills had read the proposal and raised one eyebrow approximately 2 millimeters. They want to present the financial framework before we have had time to fully respond, he told Dorothy and Claire. It is not a conversation. It is a preemptive offer they expect you to be grateful for. What do they expect us to bring? Claire asked. Themselves, said Warren. They expect you to bring yourself, perhaps a single attorney, and the particular psychological position of a woman who has recently realized her situation is worse than she thought. And what will we bring? Dorothy asked. Warren Stills paused, considered. An appropriate response, he said. They met in the conference room of a downtown firm. Neutral territory, as agreed. Claire arrived first. She wore a charcoal dress she had bought for an architecture awards dinner 2 years ago. It still fit across the shoulders. The pregnancy had required letting the waist out, but the tailor had done it perfectly. She sat at the long table. The room smelled like polished wood and filtered air, the kind of room that has hosted a great many conversations about money, that has seen a great many people walk in with confidence and reassess. Warren Stills sat to her right. Dorothy sat to her left. Dorothy wore what she always wore, simple, well-made, unremarkable. Beside Dorothy sat Helena Cross, family law, 31 years of practice. She had the quiet of someone who had won enough cases to stop feeling the need to signal competence through performance. Beside Helena sat David Marshall, forensic accountant, here because of the financial disclosure document, the one with the $3 million liability Grant's lawyers had inadvertently revealed. And beside David sat Warren's associate, Emma, with a laptop and a notepad, and the focused attention of someone who understood that her job in this room was to miss nothing. 6 chairs on their side of the table. The symmetry was exact and entirely intentional. Russell Crane arrived 4 minutes late. He walked in with the practiced ease of a man who was always exactly as late as he chose to be. Behind him came 5 attorneys from his firm. Their suits were excellent. Their briefcases were excellent. Their collective energy projected certainty the way expensive cars project speed, not through effort, but through assumption. Grant walked in last. He saw the table. He saw 6 chairs on the other side occupied. He saw Dorothy. Something shifted in his face. A recalibration happening in real time. Claire watched it happen. Watched him take in the room and the chairs and the woman sitting at her left side with 31 years of family law behind her eyes. He sat down, unsaid something he had been about to say. Russell Crane set his briefcase on the table, opened it with practiced ease, extracted a document portfolio. "We appreciate everyone coming in," he said. His voice was warm, professional, measured. The voice of a man who had run many rooms like this one. "We would like to begin with an overview of the proposed settlement framework." "We would like to begin with a question," Warren said. Crane looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. "Of course," Crane said. Warren opened his folder, extracted a single page, slid it across the table. "This is the financial disclosure your office filed on Mr. Whitfield's behalf," Warren said, specifically line 43. "The pending contractual liability of $3,200,000 arising from the Meridian Group dispute." Crane looked at the page. "Can you confirm this figure is current?" Pause. Brief, but noticeable. "The liability is under active litigation. Can you confirm the figure?" Warren repeated. Another pause. "Subject to ongoing proceedings, yes, the figure is approximate. Thank you." Warren removed a second document. Slid that across too. "This is an analysis prepared by David Marshall, forensic accountant, regarding the October transfer of marital investment assets from joint to sole ownership, in light of the Meridian liability, which Mr. Whitfield would have known about at the time of the transfer. We are prepared to argue that the transfer constitutes a purposeful restructuring of marital assets in anticipation of divorce proceedings. Under the relevant statute, that reclassifies those assets as subject to equitable distribution." Crane looked at the documents. He looked at Warren. He looked finally, fully, at Dorothy. She met his gaze with the particular expression she had been wearing for 62 years. Absolute stillness. No emotion. No signal. Nothing to read, nothing to fear, nothing to use. Grant was looking at Dorothy, too. Claire watched her husband look at her mother. She understood in this moment that he was performing a rapid and thorough reassessment of everything he thought he knew. Who is this woman? She could see it in his eyes. Who is this woman, and what is she connected to? She thought about what her mother had said. "He thought you were alone." She let herself feel, for just a moment, the satisfaction of this particular correction. Then she looked back at Crane. Crane had recovered. He was good at his job. He straightened the documents, cleared his throat. "These are interesting arguments," he said. "We will want time to respond." "Of course," Warren said. "We have also prepared a formal response to the petition itself. The filing was premature under state statute, given that the minor child has not yet been born. We will be seeking a stay of proceedings until 60 days postpartum." He paused, given Mrs. Whitfield's current medical condition. "The court will look favorably on that request, as will the press, should this become public." That last sentence landed quietly, as the best statements do. Crane looked at his colleagues. Something passed between them. Quick, almost imperceptible. Grant looked at his hands. "We may," Crane said carefully, "have room to discuss the framework in more detail." "We have time," Warren said. He folded his hands on the table, settled into his chair with the ease of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. The afternoon light came through the conference room windows at a low angle. It lit the long table, the water glasses, the neat stacks of documents. Claire sat in her charcoal dress and said nothing. She did not need to say anything. She thought about every moment in the past week and a half that had led to this room. The cold marble under her palm, the green marker on the kitchen table, the 2:14 in the morning notes on her phone, the small wooden elephant with its trunk raised. Every one of those moments had been building toward this one. She sat in it. She let it be what it was. Not loud, not dramatic, just exactly right. The mediation broke for lunch at 12:30. Russell Crane's team retreated to an adjacent conference room. Grant followed them. The door closed. Claire sat at the empty table for a moment. Warren was on a call in the hallway. Helena was reviewing notes. David had stepped out. Just Claire and Dorothy. Dorothy poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on the table, slid one toward Claire. "You did well," Dorothy said. "I did not say anything," Claire said. "I know," Dorothy said. They drank their water in companionable quiet, the kind of quiet that does not need filling. That is complete on its own terms. Then Dorothy said, "I am going to speak to Grant." Claire looked at her. "Alone," Dorothy said. "Mom, he needs to understand certain things, in a register that legal documents cannot quite achieve." Dorothy folded her napkin with neat precision. "I will be brief." Claire thought about arguing. She looked at her mother's face, the set of it, the particular stillness that meant a decision had already been made. She did not argue. Dorothy knocked on the conference room door. She entered without waiting for a response. Russell Crane looked up. His associates looked up. Grant looked up. Dorothy closed the door behind her. She stood for a moment, orienting herself to the room, taking inventory the way she always took inventory, quietly, completely. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. She looked at Crane first. "Mr. Crane," she said, "you are an excellent attorney. I have read about several of your cases. I have no objection to excellent attorneys, but I want to be direct with you, and I think you will appreciate that." Crane said nothing. He was a man who knew when to listen. "The case you have been asked to build," Dorothy said, "relies on several conditions that no longer exist. The first is the assumption that my daughter has no resources. The second is the assumption that the prenuptial agreement, as drafted, will hold. The third is the assumption that the Meridian liability was successfully concealed." She paused. "None of those assumptions are accurate." She looked at Grant. "Grant," she said, "I am going to say something to you now that I could have said 7 years ago. I chose not to because Claire was happy, and I genuinely believed that your regard for her was real." He looked at her with the expression of a man being assessed by someone he had dramatically underestimated. "I am a private person," Dorothy said. "I have worked hard to be private. I have done that because I have learned that the people who want to know what you have are not usually the people you want to know you. So I stayed small, and Claire was raised to stay small too, to lead with who she is, not what she has." She folded her hands on the table. "What she has," Dorothy said, "is a mother who has spent 30 years building something substantial, and who has not once used that resource impulsively. I am using it now." She paused. "That should tell you something about how seriously I am taking this." "Grant," said Dorothy, I am not interested in what you intended." She said, gently, "I am interested in what you did. You served divorce papers to my pregnant daughter. You restructured marital assets while she was carrying your child. You retained 6 lawyers without telling her. And you did all of this because you calculated that she would be too overwhelmed to respond effectively." She let that sit. No one in the room moved. "She was not too overwhelmed," Dorothy said. "She is my daughter." A long silence. Crane was very still. Grant was looking at his hands. "What I am proposing," Dorothy continued, "is that you reconsider the framework of this negotiation. Not because of what I represent financially, though I suspect your team is currently revising their assessment of that, but because the case you have built depends on a woman being isolated. She is not. And continuing to press an isolated woman case against a woman who is demonstrably not isolated will look, in front of a judge, the way it looks right now in this room." She rose. She straightened her blouse. "My daughter will be a good mother," she said. "She already is, and that baby is not even here yet. Whatever you decide to do next, I would ask you to think about that child, because decisions made in the next few weeks will shape the relationship that child has with both parents. And children," she said, "have long memories." She walked to the door, put her hand on the knob. Then she turned back. "Mr. Crane," she said, "one more thing, the Meridian Group, the counterparty in that dispute." She paused, briefly, just long enough. "I know them." She opened the door, walked out. She came back to where Claire was sitting, sat down, poured more water. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Claire asked. "I expect they will want to reschedule to next week," Dorothy said. "To revise their framework." Claire stared at her. "Mom." "Yes, what was that last part? You know the Meridian Group?" Dorothy smoothed the tablecloth. "I hold 17% of their preferred shares," she said. "I have held them for 9 years. I have no current leverage in their litigation with Grant's business." She paused. "But he does not know that." Claire sat back in her chair. She thought about 30 years. About quiet and patience and leading with who you are. She thought about the rocking chair in the nursery, the 2:14 in the morning notes on her phone, the wooden elephant with its trunk raised. She thought about what her mother had said to her on the phone, the morning of the envelope. "You are not alone in this, you never were." "Mom," she said. "Yes, sweetheart, thank you." Dorothy looked at her, that long, assessing maternal look. "Do not thank me," she said. "You did this. I just showed up." Claire looked at her hands. She thought about the woman she had been 10 days ago, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee going cold. The sparrow on the garden fence, the ordinary Tuesday morning. She thought about opening the envelope, the way her knees had gone soft, the cold marble under her palm. She was not that woman in the way that she had been. She was still herself, still Claire, still 34 years old and 8 months pregnant and sitting in a conference room in a charcoal dress. But something had shifted, the way ground shifts after an earthquake. Not a dramatic crumbling, just a settling into a new configuration, a new understanding of where things stand. He was not the architecture of my life, she thought. He was a room in it. A room I am walking out of. She reached across the table. She took her mother's hand. Dorothy did not say anything. She did not need to. She just held her daughter's hand in the way she had always held it. Steady and quiet and absolutely there. Warren came back from the hallway. He looked at the two of them. Read the room with the efficiency of a man who had spent his career reading rooms. Crane's associate called, he said. They would like to reschedule to next Thursday. Tell them Wednesday, Dorothy said. Warren almost smiled. Wednesday, he confirmed. Russell Crane's firm requested a 10-day adjournment. They got a week. In that week, 3 things happened. First, Grant's attorneys returned with a revised settlement proposal. The maneuvering around the joint investment account was quietly abandoned. The prenuptial challenge was withdrawn. The custody framework shifted from Grant's proposed primary residence with father to joint legal custody, primary residence with mother, generous visitation. The child support figures were recalculated at a number that reflected Grant's actual, undisclosed income rather than the liability-adjusted version. Warren Stills reviewed the proposal, revised 4 provisions, sent it back. They came back with one objection. Warren revised that too. Claire signed the document on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after the original envelope had arrived. She signed it at the kitchen table. Warren witnessed. Dorothy sat beside her, hands folded. When it was done, Warren collected the documents carefully, the way he did everything, with a quiet, thorough respect for the weight of paperwork. "That is done," he said. "That is done," Claire agreed. She put the pen down. She sat with that for a moment. 10 days. It had felt both much longer and somehow very fast. The way significant time always feels, larger inside than it looks from the outside. Dorothy put a hand on her shoulder briefly, then rose to make more tea. Some things do not change. The second thing that happened that week was a phone call from Bethany Cole. Claire almost did not answer. The number was unfamiliar, but some instinct made her pick up. "Mrs. Whitfield," said the voice on the other end. "Young, careful. This is Bethany Cole. I know you have no reason to want to hear from me." Claire was quiet. "I am not calling to explain or excuse anything," Bethany said. "I just want you to know that I did not know, for most of it, that things were the way they were. I know that probably does not help." Claire thought about what she wanted to say to this woman. She had, in her angrier moments, rehearsed several versions of this conversation. None of them, she noticed now, felt like what she actually wanted. What she actually wanted was simple. "I know," she said. "I believe you." A pause on the other end. "I ended it," Bethany said. "When I understood the full picture, I ended it." "I know," Claire said again. She did know. Warren had confirmed it. Grant had confirmed it. In the quiet, specific way that men confirm things they would prefer to leave ambiguous. "Okay," Bethany said. "I just wanted you to know. I hope you are okay." "I will be," Claire said. She meant it. She hung up, sat with the phone for a moment. She thought about what it cost to be the other woman. The particular kind of trap, that is. She had been angry at Bethany, had needed to be for a while. But anger, she had learned, is a visiting emotion. It comes, it serves its purpose, it leaves, it does not live there. Forgiveness is not the same as approval, she thought. She was not forgiving the situation. She was just declining to carry it. That was enough. The third thing that happened that week was that the baby decided to arrive, 4 days early, on a Saturday morning, in the very ordinary and extraordinary way that babies arrive. With no regard for timing, no interest in the legal proceedings that had been swirling around her, no patience for anything except being born. Claire called Dorothy first. Dorothy was in the guest room and came downstairs in under a minute, already dressed, already carrying her bag, already entirely composed. She called Nora second. Nora broke approximately 7 traffic laws. Dr. Patricia Caldwell met them at the hospital. Professional calm, the grounding presence Claire had come to rely on. The kind of person who is simply what they are every time, without variation. 14 hours later, not easy hours but not impossible ones, Claire Whitfield held her daughter, a girl, healthy and loud and definitively present. She had a small amount of dark hair in her grandmother's steady eyes. Claire looked at her. "Hello," she thought. "You are already so much more than I imagined." Dorothy was in the corner of the room, trying with notable dignity not to cry. Failing. Nora was less restrained. She is perfect, Nora said from somewhere behind two fistfuls of tissues. She is absolute perfect. She looks exactly like you. Claire looked at her daughter. She thought about the names list on the refrigerator door, the green marker circle around Emmett. She looked at Dorothy. "What do you think?" she said, "about Eleanor?" Dorothy looked up from the corner of the room. Her face did the complicated thing it did when something mattered very much. That particular stillness that was not absence of feeling but the opposite of it. Feeling held still by its own weight. "That," she said quietly, "was my mother's name." Claire had known that. She had known for years and had filed it away. Not as a strategy, not as a calculated gesture, but as something she carried. The way you carry things that have weight. "Eleanor Dorothy Whitfield," Claire said, trying it out, hearing how it sat in the air. Dorothy crossed the room. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She took Claire's free hand in both of hers. She said nothing. She did not need to. Nora made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Eleanor Dorothy," she said. "That is exactly right. That is exactly the name." The baby, Eleanor Dorothy Whitfield, did not appear to have an opinion about her name. She was engaged in the serious business of examining the ceiling, eyes wide. Hands open, already paying attention, already here, already somehow exactly herself. 6 weeks later. Eleanor Dorothy Whitfield was 6 weeks and 2 days old, and she was asleep in the white crib in the yellow room, and the small wooden elephant with its trunk raised stood on the shelf above her. Claire was in the kitchen. It was a Tuesday morning. Coffee, the radio, the low hum of the dishwasher finishing its cycle, the same and not the same, both things at once. She stood at the kitchen window with her mug in her hand and looked at the backyard, the garden she had designed herself. A landscape architect designing her own landscape, which she had always found quietly funny. The raised beds, the path made of reclaimed stone, the Japanese maple at the back corner that she had planted 3 years ago, and that was now for the first time the right height. Things grow when you give them time. Her phone was on the counter. She had started leaving it face up again. She had not realized until recently that she had been leaving it face down for most of the last 2 years. A small unconscious accommodation, hiding the screen out of some ambient anxiety that she had never named and never examined. The habit had dissolved without her consciously deciding to dissolve it. Small things change first. She took a sip of her coffee. She thought about what she had learned. Not the lessons she could have read in a book, though some of them were there too. The harder ones. The ones that only come through living something you did not choose. She had learned that love and trust are different resources. You can run out of trust long before you run out of love. And you have to be careful about which one you are drawing from when you make decisions. She had learned that silence is not the same as peace. She had been quiet for years in her marriage, accommodating, adjusting, managing. She had called that equilibrium. It was not equilibrium. It was depletion with good manners. She had learned that the people who try to minimize your resources are always at some level afraid of them, that the effort to make you feel small is never about you. It is always about what the other person cannot stand to see, and she had learned the hardest one, the one she still rolled around in her hands like a smooth stone, that she had known. Not consciously, not in a way she could have named and acted on in the middle of her life, but somewhere underneath the surface, she had known that something was wrong. She had overridden that knowledge 100 times, 1,000 times. Because it was easier, because she was tired, because she trusted him. She would not do that again, not because she would become suspicious or guarded or closed, but because she would listen. She would pay attention to what she knew. "You are not alone in this." Her mother's voice. "You never were." What Dorothy had meant was, "I am here." But what Claire had come to understand it as was something larger. She had never been alone because she had always been herself, even in the years when she had given too much of herself away. When she had shaped and bent and adjusted herself around Grant's preferences, like a tree growing around an obstacle, she had never fully disappeared. She had always at some level remained. The prison door, she thought, had always been unlocked. She had just needed the right moment to push it open. She had gone back to work 3 weeks after Eleanor was born. Part-time at first, mornings only. A few projects she was genuinely excited about. The residential garden in the hills. The family who wanted a space their children could grow up in. She had finished the design last week and sent it off. It was good work. She knew it was good work. Not because anyone had told her. Because she could see it herself. Because it was entirely hers. And there was the community green space project the city had finally funded after 2 years of advocacies. Her name was on the proposal for that one. Her name alone. She had stood in her office holding the accepted proposal, and she had felt something she did not have a clean word for. Not pride exactly, something quieter, the particular satisfaction of work that belongs to you, that cannot be taken away. that you built from the ground up with your own hands and your own eye and your own knowledge of how things grow. Dorothy was staying through the end of the month. She had set up a small desk in the guest room and managed her business from there with typical invisibility. Sometimes Claire would pass the guest room door and hear her mother on a call. Voice low, measured, authoritative, and she would feel something warm and complicated. Pride, gratitude, the specific awe of seeing your parent fully for the first time, not just as a mother, as a person, as the person she had been all along before she was anyone's mother, as the woman who had spent 30 years building something extraordinary while the world looked the other way because she preferred it that way. Nora came on Thursdays. She brought food and opinions in equal measure. She had been promoted at work the same week Eleanor was born, and she had the energy of a woman who had arrived at exactly the season she was meant for. Grant saw Eleanor on the weekend schedule that had been established. He showed up on time. He was careful with her. He was quiet and attentive in the way that people sometimes become when they have been shown, very clearly, what the consequences of carelessness look like. He did not try to make Claire uncomfortable. He did not try to revisit what had happened. Whatever the mediation had clarified for him, whatever Dorothy had said in that room, whatever the experience of 6 matching chairs had communicated, it had produced, if not a changed man, then at least a man operating with more accurate information about where he stood. That was enough. She did not need him to be different. She needed him to be accountable. There was a distinction, and she was no longer confused about which one she was asking for. A sound from upstairs. Not crying, just sound. The particular conversational noise that babies make when they are waking up and have opinions about the morning. Claire smiled, set down her coffee. She climbed the stairs slowly. The stairs had become easier, which still surprised her a little. 6 weeks of carrying less, she thought. Not just physically. She pushed open the nursery door. Eleanor was awake in the crib, arms waving, eyes very open and very bright, looking at the ceiling with the focused attention of someone encountering a genuinely interesting problem. Claire reached in and picked her up. Eleanor made a small sound of recognition, settled against her mother's shoulder the way she always did, like she was returning to a familiar place, which Claire thought she was. She stood by the window with her daughter. Outside, the Japanese maple was turning. It did this in fall, went from green to a deep, particular red. She had not been here to see it do this before. She had been traveling or distracted or simply not paying attention. She was paying attention now. "I want to tell you something," she said to Eleanor. Quietly, the way she spoke in the nursery, low and direct, like a real conversation. Eleanor looked up at her. "I am not going to pretend that none of it happened. I am not going to pretend that the year you were born was easy or perfect or the way I would have chosen. It was not." She paused. "But I want you to know, when I look back at this year, the thing I feel most is grateful." Eleanor grabbed her collar. Specific, purposeful. "Because of you," Claire said, "and because of your grandmother. And because of what turned out to be in me that I did not know was there yet." She held her daughter a little closer. "You did not need saving, by the way. I know you are very new and small and everyone is acting like you need protecting from everything. But I think you came in already knowing something. The way you kicked that first morning, when I was sitting there with that envelope. One solid kick." She smiled. "That was you telling me to get moving." Eleanor made a sound. Definitive, non-negotiable. Very much a Haynes woman. Claire laughed, quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep and real and does not need an audience. She stood at the window a while longer, watching the Japanese maple, the red of it, the way the morning light came through the leaves at that particular October angle. Low and golden and direct. The same light she had been standing in 6 weeks ago when the sparrow landed on the garden fence. The same light, and not the same at all. Then she turned, carried Eleanor downstairs. She put Eleanor in the baby seat on the kitchen counter and made her coffee properly this time. Not rushed, not distracted, not adjusted around someone else's preferences. She made it exactly the way she liked it. Strong, with too much cream. She stood at the counter with her daughter beside her and her coffee in her hand. The morning light came through the window at the angle it came through in October. Low and golden and direct. It lit up the countertop. The coffee mug. Eleanor's small waving hands. Beautiful, she thought. Just that. Just beautiful. She took a sip. Exhaled. Started the day. Eleanor Dorothy Whitfield would grow up knowing her grandmother's name. She would grow up knowing the story of the envelope, in the way children grow up knowing family stories. Not as trauma, as weather. Something that happened. Something that shaped the landscape. She would know that her mother had sat in a room with 6 lawyers and had not blinked. She would know that her grandmother had walked into a room and spoken with the particular calm of a woman who has nothing left to prove and everything to protect. She would know, because Claire would tell her when she was old enough, that strength is not loudness, that power is not performance, that the most important resources you carry are the ones you do not announce. And she would know, because she would grow up watching it, that starting over is not a defeat. Starting forward is not the same as starting over. It is its own thing entirely.